C-SPAN, Democracy Unfiltered.
Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. We're joined now by Eric Erickson, who is the host of The Eric Erickson Show, to discuss the Trump presidency and the future of conservatism. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can you talk a bit about your background in politics and your radio show?
Sure. So I grew up in Dubai, not in this country. I'm from Louisiana. Moved back to Louisiana, moved over to Georgia for college, got involved in the college Republicans, and became a lawyer. Begrudgingly, really wanted to go to Washington. My wife wasn't a big fan of going to Washington, so I stayed, practiced law, and helped start redstate.com, and then got hired by CNN as a contributor, and then by Fox News. At some point, when Herman Cain decided to run for president, I was offered his job by WSB Radio in Atlanta, Georgia, and then ultimately, after my friend Rush Limbaugh passed away, moved into his slot noon to 3 nationally. And now I'm on about 70 stations nationwide and do noon to 3 Eastern and get to talk about whatever I want to talk about, which often is politics, but sometimes culture, religion, whatever, just keeping it interesting for people.
And how would you describe your political or ideological bent?
I'm an evangelical Christian and a conservative even before I would say I'm a Republican. I was an elected Republican for a while in a city council, but I kind of view it more in the mold of Ronald Reagan than anything.
In a recent column, you expressed your opposition to the GOP budget bill known as the One Big Beautiful Bill. The headline is "The Road to Bankruptcy." Why do you think that this bill falls short?
Because it uses budget estimates that everyone knows aren't real. We are going to see an exploding deficit. We can't get an agreement on real cuts from Republicans in Washington. And something's got to be cut. I mean, the bottom line is if we were to tax everybody in the country 100%, including the billionaires, we still wouldn't be able to close or make a dent in the national debt given our spending. So at some point, something's got to be cut in Washington. And frankly, the easiest thing to do is to reform entitlements, but the president and the Republicans took that off the board immediately. So unless we're going to fix entitlements, everything else is kind of doesn't really mean much.
So what do you think that the GOP-led Senate should be doing with this piece of legislation as they move forward?
I think they are going to have to look at entitlements, more reform to Medicaid, more reform to Social Security as well. I interviewed Mitch McConnell last August. I do an annual conference, and McConnell at the point made the case that until the actual financial crisis for Congress arrives, no one's going to do anything, because if the Republicans do something, Democrats will blame them. If Democrats do something, Republicans will. So until we actually hit the bankruptcy, no one's going to be willing to do anything, which is kind of scary, but honestly, I think he's probably right. It's not reassuring, though, for people like me with kids who are going to have to foot the bill.
Moving over to the executive branch, what are your views on President Trump and how his term has been going so far?
Probably more complicated than people think. I supported President Trump in the election, and I criticize him frequently. It gets me lots of hate mail from Trump supporters. There are things I disagree with, like tariffs, but also I do actually think his heart is in the job to improve things. He certainly has got, I think, a more grown-up, mature foreign policy than Joe Biden. And I do think that some of his domestic initiatives regarding immigration and the like are fine. I think tariffs are a terrible policy. And I've got to remind myself occasionally that Trump's background is actually more that of a 1950s, 1960s Democrat than a Republican. He became a Republican over time, but his economic views haven't really changed, and I'm very much a believer in free markets.
One of the criticisms you've recently leveled at him was over his accepting the plane from Qatar. Here's a headline in the New York Post. Conservative radio host Eric Erickson rips Trump over $400 million Qatari plane purchased with the same money used to murder American citizens. Would you like to expand on that idea?
Yes, I think it's a terrible idea. Look, I don't think that Donald Trump is taking a bribe from the Qataris, and that's how it's portrayed. I think he's smart enough to realize that the Qataris are trying to influence him by doing this, and there's enough press coverage that red flags would be raised if policies were changed. At the same time, my problem is that Qatar is a funder of terror around the world. They have been a great subsidizer of Hamas and other groups that are hostile to the United States. And I don't think the President of the United States should be accepting a plane and using it as Air Force One when the country that funds the murder of Americans around the world are the ones giving him the plane.
Switching over to foreign policy, late last month, President Trump said that Russian President Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy for increased attacks on Ukraine and that Putin was playing with fire. And that prompted the former president, Medvedev, to raise the possibility of World War III. In the past, Trump has spoken favorably of Putin. I want to read what Medvedev said. He said, regarding Trump's words about Putin playing with fire and really bad things happening to Russia, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this. What do you think of the development of this relationship between Trump and Putin over time? What's changed?
Well, first, I would note that Medvedev has multiple times referenced World War III in the last, not just year or so, but in the last decade. So he seems to go to that one pretty quickly. I have viewed this the entire time as the president trying to engage in a negotiation, saying nice things about Putin to signal to the Russians that he wasn't Joe Biden. He was willing to give them a fair hearing, unlike Joe Biden, and was willing to give them to the table. And the Russians have rebuffed the offer, and now Trump is changing his tune. And at the same time, we now have a mineral rights deal in Ukraine that if Donald Trump wants to actually, having spent the time to get it, wants to make use of it, he's going to need to ensure the security of the Ukrainians. If the Russians who are cooperating with the Chinese and North Koreans are able to take over Ukraine, that deal isn't worth the paper it's written on.
Let's go to a caller, Joe in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me on. I was kind of hoping to get through to the guy from the third way, which was claiming to be left of center when they're actually right of center. For your guest, I think I want to come down to the granular level of some of the teachings in the Bible. And one of the things that's clear in the Bible that God hates, literally hates, it says this in Proverbs, is a lying tongue. And the Republican Party, though they take oaths on the Bible to come into office, they just lie constantly. Even Mike Johnson's the worst liar of them all. But here's my last question for the guest. When Jesus fed the hungry, when he fed 5,000 people with fish and bread, did he have a work requirement? I'll take my answers offline. Thank you.
Well, first I would say that all politicians are liars, frankly. And so judging politicians by the standards of the Bible, probably not the best thing. They're all going to need to repent, Democrats as well. We just went through a 4-year cover-up of Joe Biden's mental condition with Democrats saying he was fine when he wasn't. As far as Jesus, Jesus did feed the poor. He did a lot of great things, but he didn't make the government do them. He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And I just think that both sides have to be careful co-opting the Bible to say the government should do something when it's our individual responsibility. And as a conservative, I personally think that we've abdicated too much responsibility to the government so that we ourselves don't have to get our hands dirty. And we would be better off and in a better fiscal position if you and I stepped up individually to do these things instead of making the government do it.
This was one of the goals of the DOGE effort led by Elon Musk, and he's officially announced that he's leaving the government as a special government employee. What do you think of his work for the federal government and his lasting impact?
I think it was a good effort to begin with, but I know a lot of conservative groups, fiscal conservative groups, who are very frustrated that DOGE seemed more interested in using the cuts to wage a culture war than actually rein in the federal government. And, there have been lots and lots of research, whether from the Heritage Foundation or AEI or Cato or the R Institute and other great conservative groups on how to make substantive cuts to the federal bureaucracy. And a lot of those guys were ignored in favor of the culture war cuts. And while I support them, there was so much more they could have done and more constructive efforts to be able to fully cut the size and scope of the federal government had they paid attention to some of these long-standing conservative efforts to reform the bureaucracy. So we'll get maybe $175 billion out of the first claim $2 trillion, and that's a great start. $175 billion is good, but it could have been much higher, and I hope they'll continue. My hope now is with Russ Vought, who's a friend of mine in charge of OMB, pretty committed to cutting the size and scope of government over time. So I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a longer-term effort to rein in the size and scope of government.
For folks who have questions for Eric Erickson, you can call in Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. And of course, you can text us at 202-748-8003. Now, you mentioned earlier that you feel like the government should have less of a role in many sectors, and there's one area where the Trump administration has been pulling back and even cracking down, which is higher education. We discussed it earlier in the show. What do you think of the Trump administration's efforts regarding higher education, particularly the attempts to ban international students from enrolling at Harvard, and his policies towards foreign students overall?
On one side, I think the Ivy League in particular has gotten out of control. We don't see the anti-Semitism on Ivy League campuses that we've seen since October 7, 2023 in SEC schools or even ACC schools. A lot of state-run schools and smaller private colleges, it's just not there. It's a problem in the Ivy League. And I think to the extent that Donald Trump is forcing tough conversations among those institutions as to why it is that it's festering there, that's a good thing. I do think some of the heavy-handed targeting of Harvard, while part of me enjoys it, I don't actually think it's constitutional. And I do think you set a bad precedent for the future. And at the same time, for Democrats who say this will happen to Republicans if you're not careful, a lot of Republicans think it already did with lawsuits against Hillsdale College by the Department of Justice in the past and other conservative institutions. I think both sides need to try to stop picking winners and losers. And I'm afraid the Republican Party has chosen a path right now of, well, they did it, so we're going to do it too, and give them a dose of their own medicine. The problem is the ratchet always tightens, and we're just going to have this tit for tat moving forward unless there's some level of de-escalation on both sides.
Bill is in Newfield, New Jersey, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning. The reason I'm calling is the national debt. I want the national debt to be reduced, and the way I suggest the national debt be reduced is, at the present time, Social Security is collected on earnings only up to $170,000. Everybody should pay Social Security. Like the big CEO for the health company that got killed in New York, he made $10 million. There isn't any reason why Social Security wasn't collected on that from him and from his employer. If they collected Social Security for everybody, the amount of money going into Social Security would probably triple or maybe even quadruple. And my suggestion is that for the next however many years it would take, the workers' part of Social Security would go directly into the Social Security fund. The employers' part of the Social Security would go directly into a fund to pay down the national debt. When the national debt gets down to a certain level, say $5 trillion, the bill should be passed. It can never go above that again unless it's a national emergency like a world war or a natural disaster of some sort that would be catastrophic. That's my suggestion. And I feel that I suggested this once before when they had a Democratic Congresswoman on. She agreed with what I said, but nothing's done.
So, Eric, what do you think of Bill's idea?
You know, we've got to reform it in some way. I, for the life of me, don't understand why Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and other billionaires actually need their Social Security money. I realize they paid into it, but it's more of a tax and not really an IOU system. There's got to be some reform to Social Security if we're going to solve the national debt. We've got to lower the debt to GDP ratio by stimulating the economy much more. To stimulate the economy, we do need a tax and regulatory reform to simplify the system so that American small businesses can grow. With the growth of AI, frankly, I think we're going to see a trajectory where more Americans are working for small business anyway. We've got to spark small businesses. We've got to reform Social Security. Neither side wants to touch Social Security, really. They give great lip service to it. But until we're willing to fix it, raise the retirement age, alter the deductions, allow Social Security dollar for dollar all the way up, regardless of earnings, we're not going to get any changes. No one in Washington seems real serious about it yet.
Jack is in Framingham, Massachusetts, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Jack.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. You're on with Eric Erickson.
Right. Well, this refers more to your previous guest, but I'm sure Eric could contribute something to it. My idea is basically this message that should be sent out to the world by the Democrats because they don't seem to have a strong message. When referring to Trump, I think they should use the term would-be dictator. What Bernie Sanders talks about the possibility for the next generations of leaders, he's talking about an oligarchy, which is a word that most Americans probably don't even know exists. So that's my main message.
Your thoughts, Eric?
Yeah, you know, I would say that a majority of Americans, well, not a majority, but a plurality of Americans voted for Donald Trump. He won the popular vote. And the Democrats were saying, I mean, Joe Biden had that very famous speech in 2022 with the red lights and the Marines behind him in Independence Hall saying that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy, and the Republicans were. And the voters, actually, the exit polling in 2024 showed that the people who were most concerned about democracy voted for Donald Trump, not for the Democratic Party. And the Democrats have never wanted to assess that data and why voters distrusted them. The fact that the Democrats did continuously attack Donald Trump as a threat to democracy and a would-be authoritarian or a dictator, and voters still sided with him, there's never been that self-reflection on the Democrats. As a partisan Republican, one of the things I always say is that when Democrats lose, they always say it was the message, not the issues. And I think they're going to need to reassess their issues. Why did so many non-white men and even Hispanic women move towards the GOP in the exit polling? If they can't assess that issue accurately, they're going to keep losing. And I think that's one reason Republicans in Congress, to some degree, seem a little bit encouraged by the numbers right now that maybe the midterms, which historically go against the party in the White House, they might lose the House, but it might actually not be as bad as people think.
Now, one of the other ideas the caller mentioned was bringing up the idea of an oligarchy. And Trump threw a black tie gala for the top 220 buyers of his meme coin in May at the Virginia Golf Club that he owns. And he also flew in on a Marine One and spoke at a lectern emblazoned with the presidential seal. Last week, Representative Jamie Raskin, who's the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, sent a letter to President Trump demanding the release of the invites, the people who attended this gala honoring the top buyers of the meme coin. And in this letter, he said, I write today to demand that you release the names of all the attendees to this dinner and provide information about the source of the money they each used to buy the Trump coins so that we can prevent illegal foreign government emoluments from being pocketed without congressional consent. Publication of this list will also let the American people know who is putting tens of millions of dollars into our president's pocket so we can start to figure out what, beyond virtually worthless meme coins, they are getting in exchange for all of this money. Two issues there. This idea that Democrats have complained about quite a bit of the people around President Trump, particularly the wealthier people from the tech industry, and also your thoughts on this dinner in general.
You know, this is probably one of the better avenues for Democrats moving forward, but for what Joe Biden did leaving the White House with his pardons for family members. The corruption issue is one I think that Americans kind of on both sides don't like. And if the Democrats were, instead of using a word like oligarch that most people don't even know what it means, focus on tying Donald Trump's pardons to donors and making a scandal out of that, that would undermine the credibility of the White House. You know, I go back to the 2024 campaign. One of the most effective ads the Trump campaign ran against the Democrats ended with the tagline, it was on the transgender issue, people might remember, that Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. If the Democrats were able to pivot and turn that on Trump with the pardons and the donors and tie those together, they might have an issue to undermine the credibility of Donald Trump being for the working class. It's certainly an issue that Donald Trump is vulnerable to. At the same time, with Joe Biden's pardons as he left the White House for his family members, the Republicans have an opportunity to deflect it. But it's Donald Trump in the White House now saying he wouldn't operate like Joe Biden and not Joe Biden.
Peter is in Wilmington, North Carolina, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Peter.
Hey, thank you for mentioning when Jesus to the 5,000.
Peter, your line is breaking up. I just want to see if you can move it, maybe move someplace a little bit with better reception.
I'll try. Is that better?
Yes, that is better. Go ahead.
All right. I was glad. First time I've been trying for years to call and say that when Jesus fed 5,000, he wasn't ordering Caesar to do it. Anybody can do it, but like keeping things that are Caesar's his and other things along with people. But the reason I'm calling, you mentioned something has to be done with entitlements. And I'm thinking about the types of entitlements and the sources of funding, and things like Social Security, which is a central program that people work and move from state, makes sense to be federal. But things like feeding or care.
Peter, you're breaking up again. Oh.
Whether or not to have a child would be make more sense to be states. That would be state programs, but I think the resistance to moving funding from federal to state is because a lot of the states have balanced budgets and they can't borrow the way. It doesn't
okay,
hide.
Peter, your line is breaking up a bit, but I think we've got your idea. I'll let Eric respond.
Listen, I kind of agree with you that the states should be doing more of this. When the founders created the country, the federal government's a limited government. Article 8, Section 1 in thus force covers the powers, or Article 1, Section 8 rather, covers the powers of Congress. They're very limited. A social safety welfare net was something envisioned by the states at the time. Now, we've expanded it over time in World War II with Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and his Great Society program expanded it further. But at this point, we're a nation where our population rate is going down. Our future success was premised on a growing population. Reminded of George W. Bush, who wanted to privatize Social Security in the early 2000s, and even Republicans resisted what was a very good plan. And if you look back now, the people hitting retirement age would be far better off with less strain on the federal government had we gone down that route. And at some point, we're going to have to do that, while also recognizing that states and individuals are going to have to do more. One of my concerns, pet peeves as an evangelical Christian and a conservative, is that churches and individuals and charitable efforts have so much divested themselves to the federal government and said the feds are going to do this and we can be a part of it, as opposed to, bearing their cross and doing it themselves. So Jeremiah 29, one of my favorite verses of the Bible, says, "Seek the welfare of the community in which you live, and there you'll find your welfare." And instead, we're all looking to Washington, D.C. instead of our own backyard. And I think if every American started focusing locally instead of to Washington, all of us would wind up improving the country overall.
We have a question that we received from Barb in Long Grove, Illinois via text. Does Mr. Erickson feel MAGA threatens the future of conservatism in the U.S.?
I go back and forth on this. That's a great question. To a degree, I think a lot of Republicans are moving towards populism, not really conservatism. And a lot of people who said they were conservative now still say they're conservative, but they've embraced a populism that's unmoored from historic ideas. My sense of things, though...
Eric, if I can pause you for a moment, can you explain what you mean by populism?
Yeah, so populism is ideas that are popular, particularly with the working class now. There's not a coherency to the ideas. It's people like this thing, and this thing, let's do them, without any sense of historic understanding, political philosophy. Now, that sounds very nerdy, but essentially conservatism understands that as Washington grows and as taxes grow and we pick winners and losers, the economy slows down, society regresses. That's kind of where Donald Trump is. He's picking ideas that sound popular. Tariffs sound popular to a lot of people. But we know as conservatives, historically, they don't work. Now, populism historically, though, is tied to movements of individuals, charismatic figures. And when they go away, either at the state level or the national level, the movement kind of collapses. So I actually think what we're going to see happen is when Donald Trump, who is term limited and will step aside in a few years, goes away, there's going to be a fight over what MAGA means. And it's going to be MAGA that evolves more than the conservative movement. And historically, when that happens, you revert to the mean. So you move back towards a more traditional conservatism. It's not going to be the same as it was, but it'll be more recognizable once Trump is gone than while he's here organizing a populist movement.
Stephen is in Wilmington, Illinois, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Stephen.
Yeah, I'd like to understand how evangelicals could support a covetous, fornicating adulterer who bears false witness, but I do know it was just so they could get judges. And then secondly, I haven't heard any Republicans call out Trump for saying he doesn't know if he has an obligation to the Constitution after taking the oath of office twice.
First of all, I've actually written about the second one and said it is remarkable he said that, and he should recognize his obligation to the Constitution. And as to the first one, in 2016, I didn't support Trump on the issue of character. It became pretty obvious to me by 2020 that we were going to have a Republican or a Democrat. And as much as you don't like Republicans and don't like Donald Trump and don't like his character, there are a lot of evangelicals who look at Democrats and look at Joe Biden or Barack Obama, who sued nuns to try to force them to pay for abortion, or Joe Biden, who went after Christian colleges and went after Christian businesses in the country and trying to force them to adhere to a democratic progressive social agenda, and said, I don't particularly like either side, but I got to go with this guy who's not out to get me and persecute me, my friends, and my businesses. And if the Democrats would have toned down, I think, some of their progressive social agenda, you might have seen more Christian conservatives be willing to say, nah, I may sit it out. But as long as you've got people trying to put boys and girls sports and sue Christian businesses to either bake certain cakes or perform abortions or pay for abortions, you're going to have evangelicals say, I can't sit this out.
Richard is in Advance, North Carolina, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Richard.
Hey, good morning, ma'am, and good morning, sir. My question right now stems from a political opinion I have, which I personally see the Democratic Party as sinking right now, and that's an opportunity for Republicans. So how do the Republican Party, be politically attractive to people who hate Trump but feel politically homeless? Thank you, guys.
Oh, I've spent a lot of time on this issue thinking about it, and I think one of the things Republicans have to do first is, one, don't sound crazy, don't elevate voices like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert so much, and also sound reasonable, a willingness to attract people to the party. One of the advantages I actually think the Republican Party has right now is on these cultural issues, where there are a lot of people who have historically voted Democrat, but actually they're institutionally, philosophically, socially conservative. As the Democratic Party becomes increasingly a party of higher income white voters, particularly white college-educated women, a lot of the working class voters who've been voting for the Democratic Party are naturally going to move to the Republican Party. Don't be off-putting to them in how you talk about their issues. Try to relate to them, but also don't pander to them. Working class voters in particular, I think, probably have a greater sense of discernment when people are trying to pander to them than upper income voters, and they don't want to be lied to, they just want to be respected. If the Republican Party does that, as these cultural issues continue to fester on the Democratic side, I think the Republicans are probably in a better direction long term. I mean, for years, we talked about demography was destiny, and because black Hispanic voters were Democrat, Republicans' days were numbered, and actually what we're seeing is those voters are transitioning to the Republicans, and demography is only destiny if you demand that it be, and rarely is that the case.
Once again, our phone lines for questions for Eric Erickson. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. David is in St. Petersburg, Florida, on our line for Independents. Good morning, David.
Hey, how are you doing today? So I'm trying to understand. Obviously we have a ton more, people in this country. The population has grown drastically since the last time there was a Supreme Court justice and senators and Congress people added to the why haven't there been, we had increased the numbers because obviously the population in the United States has grown. And talk a little bit about how that works and how what it goes into getting more congressmen, statemen, senators, and Supreme Court justices.
Oh, and so this is probably one of the areas where my Republican and conservative friends get mad at me, but I actually think that the House of Representatives should have at least 1,000 members, maybe 2,000 members. The House is the one supposed to represent the people. The Senate represents the states, 2 senators per state. So without changing the Constitution drastically, we're not going to be able to improve that number. The Senate and the House together could expand the numbers of the Supreme Court. I don't know that we need more than 9 justices. They handle the workload fine, although we could probably expand the number of circuit courts. Congress can do that by act. It'll be filibustered unless you find a way to get Republicans and Democrats to agree to ration the picks of Republicans and Democratic appointees to the circuits. But the House is the big one. The House should be much larger. When the country was started, I want to say the number was less than 100,000 people per member of Congress. Something like, I want to say it was 25 to 50,000, and now it's 750 or so thousand. To get it back to a reasonable area where people actually know their member of Congress, you've got to dramatically expand the people in the House of Representatives. And I actually think that would be a good moderating influence on the House to have people closer to those who represent them. Most Americans now don't know their member of Congress. Historically, prior to the early 1900s, most people actually had a connection to their member of Congress because of the ratio of people to congressmen. We've got to expand the House of Representatives.
Robert is in Cape May, New Jersey, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Robert.
Hey, good morning. As an independent, I find it disheartening when I talk to my friends in either side of the aisle, Republicans or Democrats, that don't want to necessarily include me in their movement or their party when I disagree with their foreign policy, whether it's Biden or Trump. And I just think that, when Elon Musk calls Social Security a Ponzi scheme, and the Democrats and Republicans supported $15 trillion diverted to military spending after the fake weapons of mass destruction narrative. As an independent, I'm looking for somebody that will repatriate that money home for social programs, for education, infrastructure, health care, and it just doesn't seem to be possible the way our primary process is run by the donor class. Would you comment, please?
I think J.D. Vance is probably more aligned with you than you might realize. He's actually a pretty good proponent of returning most of our overseas military and the like to the U.S. for social programs. Behind Fortress America, I like J.D. Vance a great deal. He's much more isolationist than me. I do think the question, though, is the role of the United States, and both parties have typically aligned on the idea we are the leader of the free world, which means we have to deploy resources around the world. And until that changes, and it might be changing now with Donald Trump, there was a story in the New York Times last week that he's taking this great powers approach of three great powers dividing the world. You may see more repatriation of resources to the United States and the Western Hemisphere under Trump than most people realize.
This brings up the topic of foreign policy, and last week reporters at the White House did question President Trump about some of his recent comments about Russian President Vladimir Putin. I'm going to play this for you and get your response.
Do you believe the Russians are being disrespectful when they say that your criticisms of Putin are simply an emotional response? And do you still believe that Putin actually wants to end the war?
I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, we're going to find out very soon. We're going to find out whether or not he's tapping us along or not. And if he is, we'll respond a little bit differently, but it'll take about a week and a half, 2 weeks. We have Mr. Witkoff is here, who's doing a phenomenal job, is dealing with them very strongly right now. They seem to want to do something, but until the document is signed, I can't tell you. Nobody can. I can say this. I can say this, that I'm very disappointed at what happened a couple of nights now where people were killed in the middle of what you would call a negotiation. I'm very disappointed by that. Please, go ahead.
What stopped you from imposing new sanctions on Russia?
Only the fact that if I think I'm close to getting a deal, I don't want to screw it up by doing that. Let me tell you, I'm a lot tougher than the people you're talking about, but you have to know when to use that. If I think it's going to hurt a deal, this isn't my war. This is Biden's war, Zelensky's war, and Putin's war. This isn't Trump's war. I'm only here for one thing, to see if I can end it, to save 5,000 lives a week and a lot of money, the money being much less important.
Eric Erickson, what do you think of how President Trump is handling the situation between Russia and Ukraine?
I'm very much in support of defending Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, and I appreciate the president wanting to rethink things. I mean, for example, historically, if you go back to his first term, many people had always said they wanted to move the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He did it over protestation, and it worked. Lots of his foreign policy has been thinking differently from others in D.C. I do think, however, that he committed to this notion a little bit too much, that he can bring about peace, and needs to reconsider that we probably do need to support the Ukrainians against the Russians, in large part because the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, they are building, maybe you don't want to say an axis of evil, but they are building this Eastern powers coalition against the Western world that is led by the United States. And if he can't get Vladimir Putin to come to peace, which I don't think he's going to be able to do, we probably do at least need to help the Ukrainians kill the Russians so we don't have to.
Steve is in Pittston, Pennsylvania on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning. As I sit here with my wire-haired Vishla, I wonder if Democrats and Republicans really consider the fact that if Harris would have been in the White House as president, we would never have known about a cover-up. We would never have known what was going on. The best thing that happened when Trump won is that we now know what the Democratic Party is all about, and they've got to get their act together. The two most dangerous people, God forbid they ever get to power, is Hakeem Jeffries and Mr. Schumer. Those are the two that have to be alleviated from our government. And I hope that that would eventually happen in the next elections. But you got to thank Trump for saving our democracy by bringing out the truth of what happened in the Biden administration.
One of my biggest frustrations over the last number of years is that you and I could see with our own eyes there were problems with Joe Biden. And it wasn't just the Democrats, but actually a lot of members of major media outlets as well who refused to acknowledge it, dismissed it, used the phrase cheap fakes. One of the most interesting things to me that's come out of this Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson book is Alex Thompson has now said twice on two separate media outlets that even senior staff in the White House were amazed by how willing members of the media were to believe the excuses they came up with, like the phrase cheap fake, when Republicans were showing videos of something wrong with Joe Biden. And I do think until there's greater accountability also for members of the press and how they handled the last 4 years, trust in the press isn't going to go back up. And also, I do think that the Democrats are going to have to come to terms with people's trust of them. I'm kind of in the vein of Chuck Todd and others that if you are a member of the Joe Biden cabinet looking to run for president in 2028, you might have a hard time given that people are going to tie you to this cover-up.
Annie is in Tampa, Florida on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Annie.
Good morning. Good morning, Eric. I just want to say the drama of the last caller was hysterical. I mean, to be so afraid of Hakeem Jeffries is like, but that's what Trump wants, is to put fear. I'm just going to state the obvious and say that, you don't have to be corrupt for Trump to go after you. Department of Education, judges, top generals, which are, guilty of being Democratic. The pardons from Biden, they were not to hide a crime. They were to keep Trump from going after them with lies and fake. Obviously, again, he can arrest anybody with absolutely zero crime. There's zero corruption. The only thing I want to ask Eric is why Trump takes all of our money. He takes all of Americans' money, but he won't talk about the money. He won't say where any money is going, and I'm just wondering if he can help me with that.
Annie, what money are you referencing specifically?
Every investment. He cut every program, so he's cutting, as Elon did too. Just cut billions in, all the programs and, USAID. I mean, everything under the sun. Oh, also, J.D. Vance has got you fooled. He was for the war.
Well, Annie, I want to let Eric respond. Your question is the money that's been cut from these programs, where is it going?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so the money is somewhat on pause right now as the president prepares a rescission package. So the money is there. The president doesn't want to spend it. He's sending a rescission package to Congress asking them to pull the money back to the Treasury. If they don't do it within 45 days of the rescission letter, the money's going to be spent. So it's in pause. It hasn't disappeared somewhere. The president's just not inclined to spend it. I would note, by the way, Annie, on your point on J.D. Vance and the war, if you read his book, he did have an eye-opening experience in his time in Iraq, and it certainly changed his positions and his views of foreign engagement in the U.S. He was much more in favor of U.S. foreign policy and engagement around the world before he actually served in the military in Iraq and came home, and it was kind of an eye-opening experience for him. And he's now much more isolationist than I think you might give him credit for.
Patrick is in Canton, Georgia, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Patrick.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask about, I heard you make the statement about we should support Ukraine and killing Russians so we don't have to. And what I would like to know is why do we have to? Why should we be the police of the world? Or like you said, why? We're the leader of the free world. And why is that? We're an imperialistic country. And also I would like to hear your thoughts about where you think the world would be at now if they took seriously the offer of Russia joining NATO. So thank you very much.
So, the Russians, I think it's always been naive in American foreign policy to think the Russians wanted to be part of the West. The Russians have always wanted their sphere of influence. Peter the Great, historically, if you go back to the Tsarist era, had flirted with being welcome into the Western fold, but by the time of Catherine the Great, the conquering of Crimea, the Russians established themselves as their own sphere of influence, and it's always been a pipe dream of Western intellectuals that somehow the Russians could be brought into a Western fold. We saw that with possibly bringing them into NATO, which was ill-advised, and we got rid of it. The reason the United States leads the free world, though, is because of World War II. After World War II, we were the only free power that wasn't in shambles, given the war in Europe. And so Western powers, including led by Winston Churchill, de Gaulle, and others, kind of entrusted world free leadership to the United States. And we've led fairly well for a very long time in that. And I think as we fade back from that, the world goes into more turmoil. The United States is going to have to decide, do we want to lead the world or not? And if we don't, there are consequences that we can't feel right now. For example, being the world's reserve currency, as long as we're leading, we get preferred exchange rates. We have better inflation rates than the rest of the world. We have better economic transaction rates than the rest of the world. That all goes away when we stop leading the world. And there are a lot of people who say it's too expensive for us to continue in our leadership of the free world. We've got to step back. And I would argue to them that it's actually going to be more expensive for us to step back. I mean, if you look at Great Britain, which used to have an empire that spanned the whole world, they no longer lead. And their inflation rate is higher than ours. Their unemployment rate is higher than ours. Their exchange rate is higher than ours. Their transaction cost is higher than ours. It's a massive financial penalty if we choose not to lead. And not only is it a massive financial penalty, it actually jeopardizes the United States more because the only others who could lead the world right now are the Chinese and the Russians, and they are diametrically opposed to our values.
John is in Vicksburg, Michigan, and on our line for Independence. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Generally, I watch C-SPAN quite often, and you have guests on. Generally, they were either right-leaning or left-leaning. Occasionally, you'll have an independent. But the common thread in all of these is the whataboutism that goes on. It's what about Trump? What about Biden? What about the Democrats? What about the Republicans? What about Bush? What about Obama? And the conclusion that you can draw is that both sides are generally corrupt, and the only real solution is to get rid of everything and restructure the entire government. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of people have your view, but it's probably not going to happen. The only thing that Democrats and Republicans hate more than each other is a third party. So ballot access laws in all 50 states are designed to restrict the access of third parties to make it difficult to get through. That's also one reason, though, why we have more stable governments than other powers. When you look at European powers who have maybe 5 to 10 political parties, they jockey for position on ballots, and they use various allocations to get into government. We have Democrats and Republicans. It provides a level of stability where neither side particularly likes each other, and they love to call out the sins of the other side and ignore the sins of their own side. But at the same time, we know the next president's going to be a Democrat or Republican. The next Congress is going to be Democrat or Republican. And because of that, it requires those parties to not have niche ideas, but to try to broaden themselves. And that's one of the problems I think the Democratic Party has had over the last few years, is they became very niche on certain cultural issues, alienating a lot of Americans from broader cultural conversations. And they're going to have to probably moderate themselves to be able to get back into power, because we don't do niche parties in this country. We have broad coalitions.
Joanne is in Rutland, Vermont, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Joanne.
Good morning. I was just wondering why on election night, Trump was telling all his voters and making all these promises to them, how he was going to change their lives and everything. And all he's done is taking from the poor people, and giving to his wealthy friends, paying their taxes and everything. He lied to every one of his voters and made their lives worse, not better, as he promised.
You know, I would just say that Donald Trump's popularity has actually rebounded in the last month, and the Real Clear Politics polling average has gone back up, and the working class actually feel like he is helping them. So Your view may be that he's taking from the poor and giving to the wealthy, but when you look at the polling of the working class right now, they feel like he's on their side. And he actually is giving the business, and so to speak, to wealthy Democratic donors. The Democrats have this very high ideal that the Republicans are somehow the party of the wealthy, but they certainly have Elon Musk, but most of the billionaires in America voted Democrat. They've got people like George and Alex Soros and others on their side. This idea that the Republicans are the party of the wealthy when the Democrats have Hollywood and these other billionaires, I think is great PR for the Democrats, but also not grounded in reality.
Kathy is in Michigan on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Kathy.
Yes, hi. I'm a big supporter of President Trump, and I don't know who named the big, beautiful bill. Inside it is that tax supposed cut everyone's talking about. But I don't know who called it a tax cut, because it's not a tax cut. It's a tax increase. And everyone, that Democrat man who you had on the guest before, he is misinformed, but it's going to increase everyone's taxes, because what it is the tax cut on point one Trump, it's going to expire. So that's a tax increase. So everyone is going to get a tax increase, right? Or will it just nothing will happen? How would that work?
The way that this bill works is President Trump's tax plan from his first administration was timed to expire January 1st of next year unless they renew it. So what this tax bill does is it extends the tax cuts again. So we will have a tax increase if they don't pass anything. If they do pass something, our taxes won't go up, and in some cases, some rates will go down. So if this gets passed, some people will see a tax cut. A lot of others won't see anything. But if nothing gets done, everyone will see a tax increase, including corporations.
Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you very much, Eric Erickson, who is the host of the Eric Erickson Show. We appreciate your time this morning.
You.
And now we're ready to head into open forum after a short break, and so you can start calling in now. Republicans at 202-748-8001, Democrats at 202-748-8000, and Independents at 202-748-8002. We'll be right back.
In a nation divided, a rare moment of unity. This fall, C-SPAN presents Ceasefire, where the shouting stops and the conversation begins. In a town where partisan fighting prevails. One table, two leaders, one goal, to find common ground. This fall, Ceasefire, on the network that doesn't take sides, only on C-SPAN.
Weekends bring you Book TV, featuring leading authors discussing their latest nonfiction books. Vicki Nguyen of NBC News talks about her family's 1979 escape from Vietnam and their journey to become Americans in her book, Boat Baby. The New Yorker's Michael Luo, author of Strangers in the Land, traces the experience of the Chinese in America, chronicling their persistence amid anti-Asian violence. Journalists Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper talk about President Biden's decision to run for re-election in 2024 amid concerns that he was experiencing cognitive decline in their book, Original Sin. And then on Afterwards, Republican Oklahoma Senator James Lankford shares his book, Turnaround, where he speaks about his faith, the challenges the country faces, and what he believes needs to happen to improve the country. He's interviewed by Wall Street Journal congressional reporter Siobhan Hughes. Watch Book TV every weekend on C-SPAN 2 and find a full schedule on your program guide or watch online anytime at booktv.org.
C-SPANshop.org is C-SPAN's online store. Browse through our latest collection of C-SPAN products, apparel, books, home decor, and accessories. There's something for every C-SPAN fan, and every purchase helps support our nonprofit operations. Shop now or anytime at cspanshop.org. Washington Journal continues.